Thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. Today's podcast is from April 28th, 2019. Join us for a study on the life of Joseph with Pastor Dax.
So Genesis 37, this life of Joseph. I want to read to you what a New Testament author comments about this entire story that's 14 chapters long. Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. That's it. That's how the author of Hebrews boils down 14 chapters of the Joseph narrative. There's not a word about all of the different elements of the story that we find so intriguing. You know, the stuff that movies are made of. Jealousy and envy and sibling rivalry, a murder plot, betrayal, a false accusation, imprisonment, palace intrigue, famine, desperation, decades-old guilt, and then at the end, finally, forgiveness and repentance and reunion and this reconciled family. Not a word about that in Hebrews. Not a word about all the moral lessons that we can seek to draw out of this text so easily. Nothing about bad parenting. Nothing about the dangers of jealousy or the need for purity or warnings about hypocrisy. Nothing about just hang in there till the end and you'll be rewarded. None of that either. All of that, I hope we're going to see is fruit that is hanging too low for our purposes. For the author of Hebrews, the story of Joseph is about faith. A faith that allowed him to look beyond Egypt forward to the Exodus. And Joseph and his faith stand out in the drama of this story like a diamond set against black felt. He's one of only two major characters in the entire Old Testament who is presented to us with no sin revealed, the other being Daniel. And what's kind of ironic is when you add all of this together, the dramatic nature of the story, it's a good, compelling story, the easy moralistic lessons that can be plucked out of it, and this sort of flawless portrait of Joseph as the hero, all of that adds up and actually makes this narrative difficult to understand properly because we get tripped up on all that other stuff. The fact is, Joseph was faithful. His brothers were sinful. He is rewarded with power and position. There are life lessons from this text to be applied. All of that's true. But the question we want to ask is, what makes this story different than one of Aesop's fables or any other moral kind of tale? Where's the good news in this story? We might look at this story and see the need to be faithful, but where's the hope that we can actually do that? Are we just supposed to hang in there and try harder so that God will reward us in the end? Let me give you the key to properly interpreting the story of Joseph, and for that matter, the entirety of the Old Testament. We find this key in John, my favorite gospel. John 5:46, where Jesus says to the Pharisees, "For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me." Now think about that for a minute. What did Moses write? The first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, the Pentateuch, right? Genesis is the first of those 5 books. So here in John 5, Jesus is teaching us that Genesis is about him. In fact, all of the Old Testament points to him, as Jesus taught the disciples on the road to Emmaus. And so the good news that we're going to find in the story of Joseph is not that he comes from the pit to the palace. That might be good news in sort of a temporal sense, and that would be good enough if we were temporal people. But as God's people, we are more than that. We are made for eternity. And so, unless there's something in this story about Joseph that gets us ready for, or closer to, or more informed about eternity, then there's no good news at all. But thanks be to God, there is more than that. There is good news in this story, because this is the story of a people from whom a Savior will come who will bring about our eternal redemption. That is good news, and the story of Joseph is packed full of it. So as you turn to Genesis chapter 37, I want to spend just a few moments bringing us up to speed in this book, this first book of the Bible, to set the stage here. So in Genesis chapter 1, we learn that the universe was created by a sovereign God who is distinct from it and rules over it, yet he is personally involved, caring for it. And then in chapter 2, we learn that human beings were made in God's image and charged with stewarding over the creation that he had made. In chapter 3, we discover humanity's sinful rebellion against God and the reign of death that ushered into the world. But also, very importantly, we're introduced in chapter 3 to God's plan of redemption through the promised seed of the woman. And in chapter 4, we see that family line begin when Seth is born following Abel's murder. And the story starts to build from there. In chapters 6 through 9, because of the continual, widespread wickedness of humanity, God enforces moral order on his creation. He upholds his holy name, and he brings about judgment through a worldwide flood. And yet, at the same time, because he is a God who will keep his promises, he preserves Noah and his family from that judgment. And then beginning in chapter 12 of Genesis, God enters into a covenant relationship with Abraham. This relationship is designed to bring about the promised seed from Genesis 3 through the line of Abraham, making his family into a great nation and providing a land for them in which to dwell. And then the covenant from Abraham is passed down to each generation, though not necessarily to the oldest son, right? It goes from Abraham not to Ishmael, but to Isaac, and then from Isaac not to Esau, but to Jacob. And then we arrive here in Genesis 37, and we want to see, how is the covenant succession going to be passed on? As God providentially works in the lives of his people to fulfill all of his promises and purposes. And so today we begin this story of Joseph. And by the time, if you started at the beginning of Genesis and you've read up to this point, after seeing people sin over and over and over again, Joseph seems so different, so refreshing, so good. And yet he suffers greatly. At a young age, his mother dies. His foolish father favors him, which causes his jealous brothers to hate him, culminating in a violent victimization, a merciless confinement, and being greedily sold into slavery, all before his 18th birthday. And so what I want us to see this morning, here's the big point, is that God's providential care for his people is far greater than our own limited ability to comprehend it. God's providential care for his people is far greater than our own limited ability to comprehend it. That word providential or providence, if you had to summarize this story in one word, that would be a good choice. Providence refers to God's rule over, God's care for his creation. We know that God exists outside of and is separate from his creation, but he's also intimately involved with his creation, sovereignly ordering and directing all things for his own glory and for the good of his people. And so as we work our way through chapter 37 here, we're going to frame God's providential care like this in 3 parts. Part 1, Joseph's preferred status, verses 1 through 11. Then we'll look at the brothers' jealous schemes, verses 12 through 28. And then finally, Jacob's bitter sorrow, verses 29 through 36. So let's look first here at Joseph's preferred status. Verse 1. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. That last little phrase there signals the final division of the book of Genesis. Genesis can be divided into 11 sections. They're called toledotes because toledot is the Hebrew word for generations. So this final toledot here alerts us that what we're going to read from this point to the end of the book is actually part of Jacob's story. These are the generations of Jacob. But then immediately after that little preface, we're introduced to the main character in this particular episode of Jacob's story, Joseph. So verse 2 continues, Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now, a lot of commentators are pretty quick to jump on Joseph at this point and just conclude that he was acting pridefully or that he was just some sort of tattletale. I don't think that's necessarily the case. As we're going to see later in the story, Jacob probably asked Joseph to report in from time to time. And, well, as we'll see, from what we know of these other brothers, Joseph probably didn't have to look very hard or very long to discover some significant mischief. Verse 3, now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons because he was the son of his old age. Notice there, it's not just that Jacob had a soft spot for Joseph. It says that he loved him the most. Why? Well, Joseph was the oldest son from Jacob's second wife, Rachel, the only woman that he ever truly loved. And even beyond that, Reuben, the oldest of all of them, Jacob's oldest son from his first wife, Leah, had disqualified himself from the birthright by sleeping with one of Jacob's concubines. In fact, we're told in 1 Chronicles chapter 5 that Jacob gave Reuben's birthright to Joseph because of what he had done. And so Joseph now has become sort of the heir apparent. He's been handpicked by his father to lead the family into the next generation. But it's through his father's favoritism that Joseph is set up to be the object of his brother's animosity. Joseph was Jacob's choice, and he loved him the most. And he didn't even try to hide that. Look at the end of verse 3. He made him a robe of many colors. That same word is used in the book of Samuel to describe royal robes. And interestingly, in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it's translated as a robe with long sleeves. The point is, this kind of robe wasn't given to an ordinary shepherd. You don't work out in the fields in a beautifully ornamented, long-sleeved robe. A shepherd would work in a plain, sleeveless tunic. And so the gift of this robe sends a message. Joseph is management. It's a visible reminder that he has been set apart by and is preferred over the rest of his brothers. And the result of that is what you might expect. Verse 4, but when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Just imagine the tension when Joseph walked by one of his brothers and said, "Shalom," and he was met with ice-cold silence, or maybe something even worse. Joseph might have been the light of Jacob's life, but Jacob's favoritism was casting a dark shadow over Joseph's future. Now, humanly speaking, I think we can understand. We can empathize with why Jacob might have chosen Joseph to be the next head of the family, especially in light of what the oldest son, Reuben, had done to disqualify himself. And we know especially that Jacob has lost his true love, Rachel. Maybe when he looks at Joseph's eyes, he sees his former wife's eyes. Or when Joseph laughs, he hears something of Rachel's laugh. But the fact is, Joseph is put in an incredibly difficult situation at the age of 17. And it gets worse here, because it's not just Jacob who seems to prefer Joseph. Look at verse 5. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." You don't need a degree in dream interpretation to see what's being said there, right? But there's no indication here that Joseph shares this dream out of malice or spite. In fact, if anything, I think he seems rather naive about this, how this might affect his already alienated brothers, all but one of them older than he is. And it's interesting that the first dream is about a harvest, not about the family business of shepherding, almost like it points beyond the present to something that might happen in the future. And notice, too, that the brothers don't doubt or question whether or not the dream actually happened. They took dreams seriously. They knew that God sometimes used dreams to reveal things. Their own father had experienced that sort of thing. The fact that they're so greatly offended proves that they are taking this seriously, right? Verse 8, his brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Notice there, for the third time in 5 verses, we're told that his brothers hated him. In fact, it seems like this hatred is escalating. Verse 9, then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. So sharing this second dream, again, brings out the response that you would expect from his brothers, even from his father. But here's the thing. If these dreams were from God, as the brothers perhaps suspected, maybe even feared, they indicated that God had chosen Joseph for a future special prominence. And so do you see what's going on here? It's not just that Joseph has been chosen by Jacob, but according to these dreams, Joseph has also been chosen by God. And the natural man's reaction to God's sovereign choice is that he hates it. He resents it. He questions God's fairness and justice and purposes. But do you remember what Jesus told his disciples? Again, from the Gospel of John. "I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you." And it's the same situation today as it was in Jesus' day, as it was in Joseph's day. But notice here a slight different reaction between Joseph's brothers and his father, Jacob. Jacob rebukes Joseph, right? But he also hides this word up in his heart. He knows that if these dreams are from God, he cannot resist it. He can't fight it. He'd learned that lesson about wrestling with God pretty well, it seems. But Joseph's brothers had not. And the blaze of their hatred just flamed hotter and hotter with every passing day. But in terms of this story sort of unfolding here before us, it's important to recognize that God is revealing his plans for Joseph to emphasize for us, the reader, that nothing Joseph is going to experience will be the product of chance. Why do we get these dreams up front in the story? It's so that we will know that everything we see happen to Joseph is the product of God's sovereign will. And so this is Joseph's preferred status. And because of that, secondly now, we see his brothers' jealous scheming in verses 12 through 28. Verse 12, now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. This is a journey of about 50 miles or so away from where they're at. And Israel, that is Jacob, said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? And if you remember the story from earlier in Genesis, Shechem was the site of a massacre at the hands of these same brothers in retaliation for what had happened to their sister. Maybe Jacob is concerned about their well-being going back into that area, so he says, come, I will send you to them. And he said to him, here I am. Think about that. Even though he knows his brothers hate him, they can't speak peacefully to him. He's shared these dreams that have caused those wounds to deepen even further. He has a ready willingness to obey his father. This can't be something that Joseph relished doing, but he did it. Verse 14, so he said to him, go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And by the time he gets there, the brothers have already moved on. Verse 15, and a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, what are you seeking? I am seeking my brothers, he said. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock. And the man said, they have gone away, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. Now, this is another 12, 15 miles away. Joseph is already far from home. The only people in the area who know him are his brothers who hate him, and maybe some of the survivors of the massacre who hate him. Now, if this had been me, this would be the point that I turned around and went back home. If I made it this far, right? Sorry, Dad, I tried, I looked, couldn't find him. But even here, we get a little glimpse of Joseph's character and his diligence in this, don't we? So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. Verse 18, they saw him from afar, no doubt recognizing him in his special robe. And it's sort of like waving a red cape in front of a raging bull. And before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. Joseph gets them in his gaze from far away, and they get him in their sights, and they're ready to kill. This dreamer, it's a spiteful term, a mocking term. It's literally Lord of the Dreams. And they think that killing this dreamer will kill the dream. But it's even worse than that, right? Who was it who gave Joseph these dreams again? This scornful mocking of Joseph's dreams is a rejection of God's revealed plans. Notice verse 21, when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him. Don't kill him, just leave him for dead in this pit. Why this sudden display of compassion from Reuben? Into verse 22, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. In light of what Reuben had done to disqualify himself, this was an opportunity for him to redeem himself, maybe to be reconciled to his father, maybe, just maybe, have the rights and responsibilities of the firstborn given back to him. And the brothers go along with the plan. Verse 23. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. We read that so much like words on a page, but I want you to actually imagine that happening. And there's no recorded words there, but this did not happen in silence. And there he is. No way out, which means a slow and painful death for Joseph. Exposed to the elements, no food, no water, physically exhausted from repeatedly and desperately trying to claw his way out of this cistern. This is not a merciful thing. This is just another way to kill him without getting blood on their hands. It's James 3, verse 16 in motion. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. Did you notice the progression in the story from jealousy to hatred to murder? Now, in my Bible here, there's a white space between verse 24 and verse 25, where the paragraph ends. But I think if we're going to understand this chapter, we need to insert some words into that white space, words that are spoken by these same brothers 2 decades later as they reflect on this very experience. If you go to chapter 42 and look at verse 21 just for a moment. In chapter 42, this is where Joseph's brothers come before him. They don't realize it yet, who he is. They've been imprisoned by him for 3 days, and he releases him, and they're talking amongst themselves. They don't even know that he understands Hebrew yet. And this is what they say. In truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. I've read this story in the last couple of months, I don't know how many times, but this is the scene that gets me every time. He's crying out to his brothers from the pit. He's begging them not to do this. Please, you can have whatever you want. I don't even want the inheritance. Just spare my life. Don't do this. And then look at verse 25. It's unbelievable in its callousness. Then they sat down to eat. They've just thrown their brother into his grave, and they sit down with sandwiches as they hear his desperate cries ring out. Desperate cries that would take 22 years to travel from their ears to their hearts. And then all of a sudden, their lunch is interrupted by some movement in the distance. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way down to Egypt. And verse 26 makes clear that they were planning on leaving Joseph to die because now a new plan is suggested. Then Judah, mark that, Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Now, they don't like Joseph, but they don't like the idea of killing him either. And this is still a way to kill the dream without necessarily having to kill the dreamer. If they send him to a faraway land, then certainly there's no way he can rule over them. And so as their food settles in their stomachs, cooler heads seem to prevail. Verse 28, then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, 2 shekels each. They took Joseph to Egypt, And just like that, he's out of their hair. Now imagine this scene again, right? Imagine them initially seizing Joseph, tearing his robe off, yelling whatever they were yelling at him while they were doing that, throwing him down into the pit. His screams and cries go ignored, and then after a time, they pull him up. Maybe they've had a change of heart, he thinks, only to see money exchange hands, maybe be strapped to the back of a camel or something, and hauled off across the desert. John Calvin writes at this point, seeing this family, one knows why God is graciously sending Joseph to Egypt. Right? He needs to be away from these brothers. It is a mercy of God to be away from these brothers. And so now we move from the brothers' jealous schemes finally here to Jacob's bitter sorrow. Because after they sell him off, they realize they're going to have to come up with some sort of plausible explanation to tell their father. So they concoct a story. But first, notice verse 29. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and I, where shall I go?" Now it's possible this could be genuine grief and fear of the consequences of what's happened, but given Reuben's emphasis on himself, and I, where shall I go? This is much more likely the mourning of a missed opportunity for him. Either way, there's no recorded response from the brothers. Instead, they initiate this elaborate cover-up. Verse 31, then they took Joseph's robes and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood, and they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." They don't even say his name. And actually, it's unclear if they actually brought the robe themselves or just had it sent by messenger. And then notice too, they don't actually tell the lie. They just sort of paint a picture to deceive Jacob and let him draw his own conclusions. And Jacob falls right into the trap, doesn't he? He identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Now, the irony of this is absolutely incredible. Remember, years earlier, Jacob too had used his brother's clothes and a slaughtered goat to deceive his own father. Our sins always have a way of catching up with us, don't they? And if we are in God's grace, they will catch up with us before this life is over, while there is still time to repent. And perhaps this was the beginning of that for Jacob. We'll see as the story goes on. But look at verse 34. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Whereas his brothers acted with indifference, Jacob's heart is broken, and he weeps. This is God's providence. Now, when theologians talk about providence, they talk about a first cause and second causes. Second causes refer to the forces that are operating in the world, whether that is nature or the free actions of personal beings, right? Jacob favored Joseph. He gave him the robe. Joseph gave the bad report about his brothers. His brothers hated Joseph, not because they were puppets, they actually hated him. And yet all of those secondary causes are like arrows in the quiver of the first cause, God himself. God is not limited by those secondary causes, nor does he need those secondary causes to cooperate. Now they act truly, freely, but they act only as he has determined they will act. the first cause, God, makes use of the second causes to accomplish his divine purposes. And in this story, it is God who is the one working all along. But did you notice? We've been through this whole chapter twice now this morning. No mention of God. Not once in chapter 37. Now, we know the end of the story, right? We know Genesis 50, verse 20, where Joseph says to his brothers, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." But a person reading this story for the first time doesn't know that. And they're left wondering, as chapter 37 ends, where is God in all of this? Why is this happening? And all we can see for now is the final words of this chapter. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Doesn't that word, meanwhile, seem so casual for such a serious point in the story? This is the darkest moment of Joseph's life. He has no idea what's going to happen. How can we be using words like meanwhile? Seems to indicate that there's more to the story than meets the eye. God is working through this story. Did you notice? Joseph is out wandering in the fields looking for his brothers. He meets this unnamed guy who just happens to know where they went because he overheard them talking and points them in the right direction. That delay is just enough so that when he arrives at the place they've moved to, near a trade route now, shortly before a caravan of traders comes through, and then in trying to kill the dream, the brothers are actually causing it to happen. It's the finesse of providence, all directed by the sovereign hand of God. Now, one more word of warning here. It's our tendency as we read this story and stories like this to associate with the main character. We read this and we think, well, we're Joseph. Certainly we're the good guy, and all the world is against us. And so we might take something away from this like, well, I should be willing to suffer because I know that God is going to work it out for good. That's not a wrong conclusion from the whole of the Bible, but are we Joseph in this story? Think about it. A favored son, chosen by his father to receive authority and prominence over his brothers. One who is hated and rejected by his brothers for obeying his father. One who was conspired against, had clothes ripped from his body, was sold for a few shekels. No, Joseph points us to Jesus Christ. So then who does that make us? We're far more like the brothers than we are like Joseph. Like them, we too have blood on our hands, and we are burdened with guilt as we try to cover up our sin. But just as Joseph's suffering eventually brings about the salvation of his brothers, so does Christ's suffering save his brothers. Just as God was working the first suffering for good, he was also working the second, far greater suffering for the good of far more people. And in fact, in working to preserve Joseph's brothers, God was working to preserve the line of Christ. We're going to see next week, Lord willing, in chapter 38, that the messianic line, the line of Christ, does not go through Joseph like you might expect, but it goes through Judah. One of the brothers who in chapter 37 is working to kill the dream. One of the brothers who would have died of starvation had God not placed Joseph exactly where he did, in Egypt. So you see, all of life's bad events have to be interpreted in light of this greater story of salvation. God was working through Joseph to get to Christ. And believer, he means to work through your circumstances, hear me, even your suffering, to glorify Christ and to make you more like Christ. That's what Romans 8:28 teaches us, isn't it? And listen, your suffering might not even be about your Christ-likeness. Have you considered that before? What if God means to use your suffering for the good of someone else? To point them to Christ? None of us are specifically promised that every event works out for our own good in this earthly life. No, God is telling a much bigger and greater story than one with you at the center of it. And you need to know this God. This God who can scar you in order to save you or to save someone else. If we were here in Joseph's shoes at this point in the story, we would probably be asking, why me? Why do bad things happen to good people? But the question for Christians is even more pointed than that, isn't it? What we're really asking is, why do bad things happen to God's people? With all due respect, it's the wrong question. A much better question is, what is God's purpose in this thing that is happening to me? And like Joseph, we might have to ask for 20 years or longer before we get the answer. You see, God's providential care for his own people is far greater than our own limited ability to comprehend it. Do you count yourself among God's people this morning? Can you see his hand at work in your life? Is it possible that God has used the hammer of pain and the anvil of suffering in your life to shape you into a vessel that is ready to receive him? To bring you to the end of yourself and to reveal to you your need for a Savior? I pray that he has. And if you're hearing that for the first time, I urge you to repent, to turn aside from that sin and to turn toward the one who can save you, to place your faith in the favored Son who stands mighty to save.
We would like to thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. This podcast is a ministry of Victory Baptist Church in Hermiston, Oregon. You can find us at 193 East Main Street in Hermiston, Oregon, 97838, or on the web at yourvictory.org.